Did you know that, beyond the glow of movie screens and the hum of imaginary lightsabers, there are people in the real world who genuinely identify as Jedi? It sounds like the setup to a punchline, but for thousands around the globe, this is not cosplay or fandom taken too far. It is a lived philosophy. If you have ever caught yourself wondering what a Jedi's daily life might look like outside the Star Wars universe, you are far from alone. Over the past few decades, a quiet but persistent movement has emerged. Individuals formally embracing Jediism, a belief system inspired by the Jedi Order from Star Wars. And despite the dramatic falls to the dark side we see on screen, real-world Jedi are not interested in galactic domination. Their focus is far more grounded, cultivating inner peace, pursuing knowledge, and encouraging harmony among people. What makes Jediism especially fascinating is how organically it grew. Long before social media turned niche interests into global communities overnight, early internet forums in the 1990s were already buzzing with people seriously discussing Jedi philosophy. What began as scattered conversations among fans slowly evolved into something more structured, more intentional. Over time, dedicated groups formed to give the movement shape and credibility. Organizations like the Temple of the Jedi Order and the Church of Jediism stepped into that role, building curricula, publishing teachings, and offering a framework for those who felt drawn to the Jedi path. For more than a decade, these groups have not merely celebrated Star Wars mythology. They have worked to translate its themes into a coherent ethical and spiritual practice. By the mid-2000s, Jediism had moved far beyond internet novelty status. In 2015, the Temple of the Jedi Order achieved a milestone that many observers once thought unlikely: formal recognition by the United States government. That moment marked a symbolic shift, signaling that Jediism, at least institutionally, had crossed the threshold from fringe curiosity into something resembling an organized religious movement. Under the leadership of founder John Phelan, the temple secured designation as an international ministry and public charity, granting it non-profit status. In practical terms, this meant the organization could operate like many established religious charities, supported primarily through voluntary donations from its members and supporters. Perhaps most telling of all is the level of administrative legitimacy the movement has achieved. Contributions made to the Temple of the Jedi Order are tax-deductible under U.S. law, placing it within the same financial framework as countless other recognized religious nonprofits. For believers, this is more than a bureaucratic footnote. It is validation that their philosophy, however unconventional its origins, has carved out a recognized place in the modern spiritual landscape. And in a world where the line between myth, meaning, and personal identity is becoming increasingly fluid, the rise of real-world Jedi may say more about us than it does about a galaxy far, far away. One of the biggest misconceptions about Jediism is the assumption that its followers are simply devoted fans who took their love of Star Wars a little too far. In reality, practicing Jedi are usually quick to draw a firm line between inspiration and worship. Yes, the philosophy traces its modern cultural roots back to the Jedi Order portrayed in Star Wars, but adherents do not treat the films, or their creator, as sacred objects of devotion. There are no shrines to lightsabers, and certainly no prayers directed toward George Lucas. For most who walk this path, Jediism is not about venerating a piece of pop culture. It is about extracting meaningful ethical and philosophical principles from a story that happened to resonate deeply with millions of people. In fact, many within the movement are careful, almost protective, about maintaining this distinction. They emphasize that Jediism stands on its own as a belief system concerned with mindfulness, moral discipline, compassion, and personal responsibility. The films themselves often function more like teaching parables than sacred scripture. Scenes and character arcs may be referenced to illustrate ideas about balance, self-control, or the dangers of ego, but they are not treated as literal truth claims about reality. This approach allows Jediism to occupy a curious middle ground, culturally modern in its imagery, yet philosophically aligned with much older wisdom traditions. The Temple of the Jedi Order expresses this position with notable clarity, stating, "Jediism is not based in fiction. but we accept myth as a sometimes more practical means of conveying philosophies applicable to real life. That sentence quietly reveals the intellectual backbone of the movement. Rather than rejecting myth, Jediism leans into it, recognizing what thinkers from Plato to Joseph Campbell have long argued, that stories often communicate human truths more effectively than abstract theory. Within this framework, Star Wars becomes less a sacred text and more a symbolic language, a narrative vessel carrying ideas about discipline, balance, and ethical living into the modern world. So when people imagine real-world Jedi bowing before movie posters or pledging loyalty to a filmmaker, they miss the deeper point entirely. For committed practitioners, the lightsaber is metaphor, the Force is philosophical shorthand, and the real work happens not in fantasy, but in the quiet, often difficult effort of trying to live with greater awareness, restraint, and compassion in everyday life. Despite the calm, introspective image many Jedi practitioners try to project, their presence in the real world has not always been met with understanding. In fact, followers of Jediism frequently find themselves walking a thin line between curiosity and ridicule. For some observers, the idea of a modern spiritual path inspired by a space opera still feels too unconventional to take seriously. And when belief systems challenge social expectations, even peacefully, they can attract friction. One of the most widely discussed incidents occurred in 2009, when Daniel Jones, founder of the Church of Jediism, was asked to leave a Tesco supermarket in the United Kingdom after refusing to remove his religious hood while shopping. According to Jones, the request was not merely inconvenient, it felt deeply humiliating. He argued that wearing head covering was part of his religious expression and pointed to the movement's own doctrinal guidance to support his stance. In his words, "It states in our Jedi doctrination that I can wear headwear. It just covers the back of my head. You have a choice of wearing headwear in your home or at work, but you have to wear a cover for your head when you are in public." The incident quickly became a flashpoint in debates about religious recognition, personal freedom, and where society tends to draw the line between legitimate belief and perceived novelty. Whether one views the case with sympathy or skepticism, it highlights a broader truth. Emerging belief systems often face resistance long before they gain social familiarity. Yet beyond the headlines and occasional controversy lies something far more central to Jediism's identity, its ethical framework. Those who identify as real-world Jedi may not claim the supernatural abilities portrayed in Star Wars, but many are deeply committed to living by a structured moral philosophy. At the heart of that philosophy sits the Jedi Code, a compact set of principles adapted from the fictional universe, but interpreted as practical guidance for everyday life. Rather than serving as dramatic movie dialogue, the code functions more like a mindfulness manifesto, encouraging emotional discipline and deliberate self-awareness. In the fictional world created by George Lucas, the code exists to help Jedi Knights remain centered, preventing fear, anger, and impulsiveness from pulling them toward the dark side. Real-world adherents reinterpret this idea in psychological and ethical terms. The emphasis shifts from cosmic battle to inner regulation, reducing ignorance through learning, replacing impulsivity with reflection, and choosing harmony over emotional reactivity. Many practitioners describe the code not as a rigid commandment list, but as a daily compass, a reminder to pause, breathe, and respond to life with intention rather than reflex. For converts to Jediism, this moral structure often becomes the most compelling aspect of the path. Strip away the robes, the pop culture associations, and the internet jokes, and what remains is something surprisingly familiar: a disciplined attempt to live thoughtfully in a noisy world. And perhaps that is the quiet irony at the center of modern Jediism. What began as fiction has, for some, evolved into a very real framework for pursuing clarity, balance, and ethical self-mastery in ordinary human life. Although it can feel like a recent internet-age curiosity, Jediism's roots actually stretch back further than many people realize. The movement has been quietly evolving for more than 2 decades, with its early momentum closely tied to the cultural aftershock of Return of the Jedi in 1983. When audiences first left theaters after watching the climactic chapter of the original Star Wars trilogy, few could have predicted just how deeply the mythology would embed itself into real-world identity and spirituality. At the time, the expanded universe had not yet fully taken shape, and the prequel trilogy was still years away from materializing. For some devoted fans, embracing Jedi-inspired philosophy became a way to keep the spirit of those stories alive, not merely as entertainment, but as a personal ethical compass. Over the years, what began as scattered philosophical discussions gradually crystallized into something more organized. Online forums in the early internet era served as incubation chambers, where like-minded individuals debated the meaning of the Force, discipline, and balance in ways that increasingly resembled genuine spiritual inquiry. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Jediism had developed recognizable communities, shared teachings, and structured paths of study. What is striking is not merely its longevity, but its persistence. In a digital landscape where most niche movements flare up and vanish, Jediism quietly endured, adapting to new generations while preserving its core emphasis on self-mastery and mindful living. Perhaps the clearest sign that Jediism had outgrown its niche origins came in 2001, when national census data in several countries revealed something unexpected. Tens of thousands of people formally listed Jediism as their religion. What might have begun as curiosity, or in some cases playful protest, quickly revealed a deeper pattern. A meaningful number of individuals genuinely identified with the philosophy behind the label. In England and Wales alone, 390,127 people described themselves as Jedi, representing roughly 0.3% of the population, and making Jediism the seventh largest reported religion in that census. The numbers were similarly striking elsewhere. More than 50,000 people in New Zealand claimed the identity, while over 70,000 did so in Australia. Across Ireland and other regions, the pattern repeated. For many adherents, the goal was not simply symbolic participation. There was a clear push in some communities to see Jediism formally recognized alongside more established faiths. These figures reveal something psychologically fascinating. In an era often described as increasingly secular yet spiritually restless, Jediism appears to occupy a peculiar middle space, modern in imagery, but ancient in the human needs it speaks to: belonging, discipline, meaning, and a framework for ethical living. Contrary to the assumption that Jediism is built purely on science fiction mythology, its philosophical architecture draws heavily from much older traditions. The movement openly acknowledges influences from Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity, weaving together elements from each into a hybrid ethical system. The Temple of the Jedi Order itself outlines 16 teachings and 21 maxims, many of which echo principles that have guided spiritual seekers for centuries. For example, one of the core teachings reflects the Zen Buddhist emphasis on meditation and disciplined awareness. Within Jediism, practitioners are encouraged to cultivate mental clarity through sustained contemplation. As the temple expresses it, Jedi maintain a clear mind, which can be achieved through meditation and contemplation. Our minds can become unduly troubled and concerned with the happenings of the world. We must work on overcoming our individual issues through training and diligence. The language may be modern, but the underlying philosophy is unmistakably ancient. This blending of traditions is not accidental, it is foundational. Rather than presenting itself as a revealed religion with exclusive truth claims, Jediism positions itself more like a philosophical synthesis, an attempt to translate perennial wisdom into a cultural vocabulary that contemporary audiences intuitively grasp. Among the various organizations within the movement, the Temple of the Jedi Order remains one of the most visible and structured. It was founded in 2005 by John Phelan, a former Catholic who became disillusioned with certain institutional positions he felt were too rigid for his evolving worldview. Issues such as same-sex marriage, reproductive rights, and the role of women in religious leadership contributed to his departure from Catholicism and ultimately shaped the inclusive ethos he wanted Jediism to embody. One of the temple's most distinctive features is its openness. Unlike many traditional religions, Jediism generally does not require converts to renounce previous beliefs. Individuals are often free to explore Jedi philosophy alongside other spiritual identities. This flexible posture reflects a broader intellectual humility within the movement. As Phelan himself emphasized, religion is not a closed book. There's things people believe that turn out to be false. We're open to change, we question. That willingness to question, rather than demand strict doctrinal loyalty, helps explain why Jediism continues to attract individuals who feel spiritually curious but institutionally cautious. In a time when many people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, Jediism offers a framework that feels structured without feeling suffocating. At the philosophical core of the temple's teaching system sit three foundational tenets: wisdom, knowledge, and focus. According to the organization, when properly practiced, these principles function less like abstract ideals and more like practical tools for personal development. The temple describes their purpose succinctly. When used correctly, the Jedi tenets allow us to better ourselves and overcome any obstacle. They help us improve the world around us and fulfill our purpose in life as a Jedi. Each tenet carries a specific emphasis. Wisdom is framed as the careful and patient application of experience. Knowledge involves disciplined learning and attentiveness to reality. Focus is perhaps the most psychologically modern of the three, described as the ability to prune away distractions and direct one's full mental energy toward the task at hand. In an age defined by constant digital fragmentation, that last principle resonates with surprising power. Stripped of its cinematic associations, the Jedi path begins to look less like fantasy and more like a structured mindfulness discipline dressed in contemporary myth. Not everyone within the broader Jedi movement agrees on interpretation or emphasis. Daniel Jones, founder of the Church of Jediism, has even described the Temple of the Jedi Order as fundamentally Christian in structure. His own organization, established in 2008, shares overlapping themes but does not fully align with the temple's framework. The Christian influence becomes particularly visible in the temple's creed, which draws inspiration from the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi. The parallels are difficult to miss. Much like the historic Catholic devotion, the Jedi Creed elevates love, forgiveness, peace, and humility as central virtues. This borrowing again highlights a recurring pattern within Jediism. Beneath the modern aesthetic lies a philosophical DNA that is deeply traditional. If all of this still sounds surreal, there is even a feature documentary that explores the movement from the inside. American Jedi offers a surprisingly intimate look at practitioners attempting to live out Jedi principles in ordinary life. Rather than focusing on spectacle, the film follows three apprentices as they undergo training, personal trials, and the symbolic process of being knighted within the community. Directed by Laurent Malaquais, who also created the unexpectedly popular Bronies, the extremely unexpected adult fans of My Little Pony, the film approaches its subject with a tone that is more curious than mocking. What emerges is not a portrait of delusion, but of people searching, in their own unconventional way, for discipline, meaning, and belonging. And perhaps that is the most revealing insight of all. Strip away the robes, the internet jokes, and the science fiction origin story, and Jediism begins to look less like a cultural oddity, and more like another chapter in humanity's long, ongoing attempt to answer the same ancient question: how should we live?